Hi, Andrew from SACS. Much has been written and spoken about in recent years about the decline in mental health of young people in Australia and across the world. In this video, we're going to look at the evidence that this is happening, and secondly, we'll look at some causes. We do warn you, we will be speaking about suicide, so if this is triggering, please do not watch on. Firstly, what's the evidence that this is happening? So this Bota et al. Study looked at the mental health of people in different age groups, and what you'll see is that people who are in the 65 to 74 age group, their mental health is staying pretty much the same year after year after year. People who are in the 55 to 64 age group, again, reasonably similar, slight decline. Once we get to the younger groups, such as 15 to 24, you'll see that 20 years ago, mental health was considerably higher than it is now. So, and in particular, since about 2008, you see that there's a collapse in mental health for this group, and that's mirrored in some of the other young groups, such as 25 to 34 and 35 to 44. Of course, this data is self-report, so you're asking people about their mental health, and this is people's perception of their mental health. With these self-reports, people who are in the older age groups came from a time where it was really not acceptable to say, I am psychologically unwell, or I'm not coping, or something like that. And here, in the younger groups, it's more than acceptable to say that. So that could be a contributor of itself, purely and simply the fact that it's an acceptable thing these days to say, I am not coping. That may well contribute to these results. So let's look at some third-party data. Now, often suicide is used as a proxy for mental health, so let's see what that tells us. So this data is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it was released in 2023. And if you look at this, this has got suicide rates for various young groups. And so you've got people who are 14 and below, 24 and below, 15 to 17 and 18 to 24. Now here in Australia, if you're between 15 and 44, suicide is the leading cause of death. The highest being about 13 to 14 in 100,000 for 18 to 24-year-olds. What do they show us? Well, they show us that rates of suicide of 14 and below, pretty much what they were 20 years ago. If you look at the groups of 15 to 17, pretty similar, maybe a fraction higher, but you're talking about 6 to maybe 6.3 or something like that per 100,000 people. And the people 18 to 24, back in the 2000s, they were quite high, and they peaked at around about 2020 and then came down again over 2022. So the data, tragic data, of course, on child suicide is quite illuminating, because what you're getting is a collapse or a very significant decline in particularly young people's self-report of their psychological well-being. And you might expect that you get a concomitant rise in suicide from that, but we're not seeing that. So that is, in a sense, reassuring. So what's causing all of this? What you see here is a mapping of resilience by age. So SACS measured thousands of people across Australia and New Zealand and measured their levels of resilience. And what you'll see is that the levels of resilience decline as you get younger. And certainly one of the things that we know is that longitudinally, there has been a decline in resilience in young people. And this has been posited for a range of different reasons, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But if you measure the levels of resilience of your average 20-year-old, let's say 20 years ago, it was considerably higher than the average 20-year-old now. Now, this has had workforce planning implications, because there are jobs that you could expect the average 20-year-old to do 20 years ago that you can't expect the average 20-year-old to do now. People's levels of resilience have declined. And that may well be a key contributor to that kind of collapse in self-reported mental health. Firstly, it's cool to say that I am not coping these days. But as well as that, if your resilience declines, of course, you're not coping, because resilience is a protective factor against negative experiences psychologically. So why has this decline in resilience taken place? And one of the components appears to be parenting. I've used the term cosseting, a style of parenting which is overly protective. Now, we understand why this has happened and why there's been a decline in a thing called risky play. So risky play might be, you go to a playground, and years and years and years ago, you'd go to a playground and kids could climb up on things and they could fall off and they could hurt themselves. But ultimately what happened is that they took risks and they proved to themselves that they could survive those risks, get back into a safe situation, and that built a sense of resilience. I can cope. And I guess a key message about resilience is you don't make people more resilient by solving their problems. You make people more resilient by causing them to understand that they can solve their problems. Now, talking about risky play, I think clearly public liability has contributed to this. Playgrounds across the world have been made safer because people got sued. But as well as that, expectations of parenting have changed. I had very good parents when I grew up, and I grew up on top of the Dandenong Ranges in the country in Victoria. And my parents these days would be held in serious question about the way that they parented me, because as long as I turned up for dinner, that was good parenting. So I'd get on a bike and I'd ride off into the bush and I'd disappear for hours and hours and hours on end. And if somebody had asked my parents, "Where's Andrew?" nobody could have said where I was, yet I came home. That kind of risky play causes people to be more resilient. And it's really interesting to see in Scandinavian schools, for instance, the percentage of time that people spend outside specifically to pursue resilience. So parenting, protective parenting, appears to have caused a decline in resilience. You see, the second thing that we mention here is priming. You must be mentally unwell. I just want to talk a little bit more about priming. Human beings are very easily primed, and I haven't got time in this video to go into it in great detail, but you can prime people in an incredibly wide range of ways. You can prime them to be confident. You can prime them to be self-doubting. You can prime them to be focused on money, or you can prime them to be focused on spiritual matters. What happens before something, particularly the messages that people are sent on those matters, will prime them to see these things in certain ways. Now, it's often been said that it's a great thing that we speak so much about our psychological well-being these days, and we kind of own our sadness and those kinds of things. Well, is it a great thing? If you go back to a time where we were absolutely banned from saying that we're struggling or something like that, well, clearly that's not the answer. But on the other hand, we know that if you focus too much on something, particularly if you tell yourself or you are told that you're psychologically unwell, there is good evidence that that can cause a decline in people's psychological well-being and their resilience. So I think we have to be very careful in the messaging. A more contemporary messaging is that you can learn skills to help you to cope with whatever you face in your life. You can get help, you can get support, but ultimately you can solve your own problems. If we can cause people to be primed for self-efficacy, as a guy called Bandura called it, self-efficacy is, I can get this done, I can cope, I can be resilient. That will cause people's psychological well-being to be higher. And I think that kind of priming is better than a priming that says you must be damaged, you must be hurt, because ethically, I believe that is causing damage to people's psychological well-being. And the final thing we mention is screens. It's shown, there is good research evidence that mindfulness, being in the here and now, causes people to be less anxious and less depressed. What is it if you're living your life through screens? You're not being in the here and now, you're living your life through a fantasy. And being removed from the here and now causes us to become more anxious and depressed. So it would appear that the decline in mental health comes from a range of different things. I don't want to seem like I'm criticizing young people in terms of them losing their resilience. In fact, I don't consider it to be their fault at all. I think there are a combination of circumstances where if we're able to tackle some of these things differently, we could increase people's levels of resilience. And it's really interesting now to see Scandinavian school systems and others around the world trying to focus on this. A key offering of SACS is psychological measurement at the individual level, psych testing, and at the group level, things like 360-degree feedback and wellbeing surveys for organisations. If you'd like to find out more, click on the link near this video or come to our website. Let us know how we can help you.